What would you do if your HOA suddenly slapped you with thousands in unpaid dues? Money you knew you never owed. Worse, when you demand answers, they double down, threaten fines, and refuse to explain. Homeowners associations created to maintain order, but what happens when they abuse their power? Today's story is about a man who received a shocking demand, thousands in unpaid dues he never actually owed. At first, he thought it was a simple mistake, an error that could be fixed with a quick phone call. But the deeper he dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't a clerical error. It was something much worse. The HOA refused to budge, enforcing penalties without proof, shutting down his appeals, and threatening legal action if he didn't pay up. But instead of backing down, he did something no one expected. He turned the tables, exposing hidden discrepancies that shook the entire community. This isn't just a story about one homeowner fighting back. It's about how knowledge, persistence, and the right strategy can challenge corruption in even the most rigid systems. Stay with me. This is about to get intense. For years, Mark had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood without trouble. The HOA, a governing body meant to keep things in order, had always been strict but never outright unreasonable. At least that's what he thought, until the day he received an official-looking letter in his mailbox. It was a demand for payment, claiming he owed thousands in unpaid HOA fees. At first, Mark assumed it was a mistake, a simple miscalculation that could be corrected with a quick phone call. But when he reached out, the response was anything but reassuring. The HOA representative was curt, almost dismissive, insisting that the records were accurate and that he had no choice but to pay immediately or risk fines, legal action, and even a lien on his home. Confused and frustrated, Mark pulled up his bank statements. Every HOA payment was there, on time in full, properly documented. Armed with proof, he returned to the HOA office, expecting a straightforward resolution. Instead, he was met with hostility. They refused to acknowledge his receipts, brushing him off with vague excuses about system errors and missing records. The more he pushed for clarity, the more resistant they became. Then came the penalties. The HOA tacked on late fees, interest charges, and administrative costs, inflating the supposed debt beyond what Mark had ever imagined. It didn't matter how much evidence he provided, their stance remained unchanged: pay up or face the consequences. Mark knew something wasn't right. He wasn't the type to let things slide, and he certainly wasn't about to hand over money for a debt he didn't owe. So he started digging. He reached out to neighbors, wondering if anyone else had faced similar issues. To his surprise, several homeowners admitted they had received questionable fee adjustments in the past, though most had just paid to avoid trouble. Others shared horror stories about HOA board members who seemed more interested in exerting control than actually managing the community fairly. That's when Mark realized this was bigger than just him. The HOA wasn't just making mistakes. They were taking advantage of their authority. But if they thought he was just another homeowner who would roll over and comply, they had severely underestimated him. Mark had spent years working in finance. Numbers, audits, and financial discrepancies were his territory. If something shady was happening, he was going to find it. And he wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to make sure the entire neighborhood knew exactly what was going on. What started as a simple billing dispute was about to unravel a much larger problem. And once Mark started pulling at the loose threads, the entire foundation of the HOA's power was at risk of collapse. Mark knew he was onto something, but he hadn't expected the HOA to retaliate so aggressively. The moment he started asking questions, things took a turn for the worse. First, the fines skyrocketed. What started as a few $100s in late fees suddenly ballooned into thousands overnight. New charges appeared: administrative processing fees, compliance penalties, vague terms that had no clear explanation. It was clear now this wasn't an error. This was a power play. Then the harassment began. Mark started receiving notices almost daily, each more threatening than the last. One warned that his unpaid balance could lead to a lien against his home. Another stated that continued defiance of HOA policies could result in legal action. But what defiance? All he had done was ask for proof, for an explanation, something any homeowner had a right to. But the real warning sign came in the form of a visit. One evening as Mark returned from work, he noticed a car idling near his driveway. A man in a suit stepped out. It was the HOA president himself, Mr. Langley. With a forced smile, he casually mentioned how unfortunate it would be if Mark's house were to be labeled as a nuisance property. How the HOA had the right to enforce maintenance inspections and issue fines for violations. Violations that they alone determined. Mark wasn't easily intimidated, but he understood the message. They wanted him to back off. They were letting him know, in no uncertain terms, that fighting them would come at a cost. Undeterred, Mark escalated his approach. He formally requested an audit of his account records. The request was ignored. He attended the next HOA meeting, prepared to demand answers in front of the board and his neighbors. But when he arrived, he found that his speaking time had been removed from the agenda. When he tried to push back, security, hired by the HOA, escorted him out. Then came the final straw. One morning, Mark woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to his door. Violation notice. Final warning. It cited vague infractions, overgrown grass, unauthorized modifications to his property, failure to comply with HOA directives. It was clear they were fabricating reasons to fine him into submission, but instead of scaring him off, it only fueled his determination. He knew now that this wasn't just about him. How many other homeowners had been bullied into silence? How many had paid unjust fees simply to avoid the stress of a fight? Mark wasn't going to be one of them. The HOA had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated him. If they wanted a fight, he was going to give them one. And he was just getting started. Mark knew he couldn't go head-to-head with the HOA without solid proof. If they were going to play dirty, he needed leverage. Something undeniable. Something that would force their hand. So, he started digging. He requested the HOA's financial records under the association's bylaws. But unsurprisingly, his request was met with silence. That didn't deter him. Instead, he reached out to a few longtime residents, homeowners who had been in the neighborhood for decades. To his surprise, they had their own suspicions. Fees had been rising inexplicably, special assessments were being charged without detailed breakdowns, and penalties seemed to be handed out selectively. That's when Mark had an idea. He filed a formal records request through an attorney, citing state laws that required HOAs to disclose financial information to homeowners upon request. He expected resistance, but he wasn't prepared for what came next. A week later, Mark received a letter from the HOA's legal team, a thinly veiled threat stating that his persistent inquiries were being noted and that the board reserved the right to take further action if his disruptive behavior continued. In other words, they were warning him to back off. But instead of scaring him, it confirmed what he already suspected. They were hiding something. Determined, Mark took a different approach. He reached out to a former board member, someone who had resigned years ago over internal disagreements. After some hesitation, they finally agreed to meet. Over coffee, the ex-board member revealed what Mark had been looking for. HOA funds had been mismanaged for years. Expenses were routinely inflated, contracts were awarded to board members' friends and family, and financial audits had been delayed indefinitely multiple times. Then came the bombshell. Mark learned that the HOA president, Mr. Langley, had been quietly increasing his own administrative compensation under the guise of operational costs. In other words, he was using HOA funds to pad his own pockets. That was it. That was the proof Mark needed. He immediately compiled everything saying testimonies, old meeting notes, records of sudden fee hikes, and started reaching out to other homeowners. He needed them to see what was really happening behind the scenes. The turning point came at the next HOA meeting. Mark didn't just show up, he came prepared. With printed documents in hand and a calm but firm voice, he laid out the facts in front of everyone. He exposed the financial irregularities, the board's shady practices, and Langley's personal gains. Gasps filled the room, murmurs spread like wildfire. Homeowners who had once ignored Mark's warnings were suddenly listening. Langley tried to cut him off, but it was too late. Mark had pulled the curtain back, and now the entire community could see the truth. And as the weight of the revelation settled, it became clear. This wasn't just a dispute over fees anymore. This was fraud. And Mark wasn't about to let it slide. Mark wasn't just going to expose the corruption. He was going to dismantle it. With the evidence in hand and the homeowners finally rallying behind him, he took the next step: legal action. It started with a formal complaint filed against the HOA, citing financial mismanagement, abuse of power, and violations of state homeowner association laws. But Mark didn't stop there. He also reached out to local media, and within days, the story had gained traction. News outlets latched onto the scandal, framing it as yet another case of unchecked HOA power spiraling out of control. The community's dirty laundry was now being aired for the world to see, and the pressure was mounting fast. Langley and the HOA board tried to fight back, dismissing the accusations as misinterpretations and misguided personal grievances. But the damage had already been done. Other homeowners, many of whom had stayed silent out of fear, started coming forward with their own stories. Unfair fines, selective rule enforcement, unexplained charges on their HOA dues. The more people spoke up, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about Mark. It was a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. As the case moved forward, Mark's legal team subpoenaed the HOA's financial records. That's when things really started to unravel. The documents revealed everything: misallocated funds, improper expenses, and the undeniable proof that Langley had been siphoning HOA money into consulting fees paid to a company registered under his own name. It was fraud, plain and simple. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the HOA's legal team scrambled to settle, offering to step down in exchange for Mark dropping the lawsuit. But Mark wasn't interested in quiet deals behind closed doors. He wanted accountability. The courtroom battle that followed was intense. The HOA's lawyers tried every trick in the book, delaying hearings, claiming technicalities, and even attempting to discredit Mark's motivations by calling him a disruptive homeowner with a vendetta. But none of it worked. The facts were irrefutable, and the judge wasn't buying their excuses. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the homeowners. Langley and the board were removed, and a full audit of the HOA's finances was ordered. Criminal charges for embezzlement were also filed against Langley, sealing his fate. The victory wasn't just legal, it was personal. But the real moment of triumph came when Mark walked out of the courthouse to find a crowd of homeowners waiting for him. They cheered, shook his hand, and thanked him for standing up when no one else would. This wasn't just about beating the HOA. It was about proving that power, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be challenged when people refused to back down. And as Mark stood there, looking out at the relieved faces of his neighbors, he knew one thing for certain: this battle had changed everything. The battle was over, but the impact was just beginning. The court's decision wasn't just a victory for Mark. It was a reckoning for the entire community. The ruling forced the HOA to overhaul its governance, implementing strict financial oversight, transparent election processes, and clear limitations on board authority. Homeowners who had once felt powerless under the HOA's unchecked rule now had a voice. Langley, once the untouchable HOA president, was no longer the one making the rules. Instead, he faced criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. His reputation shattered, his influence gone, and his future uncertain. He had no choice but to disappear from the very community he had once controlled. For the first time in years, homeowners felt a sense of relief, a weight lifted from their shoulders. But the story didn't end with the courtroom ruling. Mark knew that real change required more than just removing corrupt leaders. It meant ensuring the system itself could never be abused again. Along with a newly elected homeowner-approved board, he helped establish community-led checks and balances. Every HOA decision was now subject to homeowner votes. Financial reports were made publicly accessible, and legal protections were put in place to prevent another Langley from rising to power. As word of the case spread, other HOAs took notice. The scandal became a cautionary tale, prompting homeowners across the state to scrutinize their own associations. Some communities even followed Mark's example, demanding audits, holding their HOAs accountable, and exposing misconduct. What had started as a personal fight over an unjust parking rule had grown into something much bigger, a movement that inspired homeowners everywhere to take back control. Standing on his front porch, Mark watched as his neighbors gathered in celebration. The relief on their faces, the laughter, the casual conversations, things that had once felt impossible under his Langley's rule, now felt normal again. It was a simple yet powerful reminder that communities thrive not under control, but under trust and fairness. Mark hadn't set out to be a hero. He was just a homeowner who refused to be silenced. But in the end, that was all it took to change everything. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up, ask the right questions, and refuse to back down. And when they do, they don't just win battles. They rewrite the rules for everyone. Mark's story is more than just a legal battle against an overreaching HOA. It's a testament to the power of persistence, the necessity of standing up against corruption, and the undeniable impact one determined individual can have on an entire community. This wasn't just about a parking rule or fines. It was about control, about people in power believing they were untouchable, and about what happens when someone finally says, enough. It's easy to feel small when facing an institution, especially one designed to wear you down with legal jargon and bureaucratic red tape. That's exactly what Langley and the HOA board counted on. They expected homeowners to comply, to accept the rules, to give in without a fight. But what they didn't anticipate was someone like Mark, someone who refused to be intimidated, who did the research, asked the hard questions, and fought not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by a system designed to serve only those in power. Mark's victory didn't just change his neighborhood. It set an example. It proved that no system is immune to scrutiny, that no authority is above accountability. It showed that when people come together, when they educate themselves and refuse to back down, they can challenge even the most rigid structures. And the impact of his fight stretched far beyond his community. Homeowners across the state took notice, questioning their own HOA policies, demanding transparency, and ensuring that their voices mattered. But there's a deeper lesson here, one that applies to more than just homeowners associations. This is about knowing your rights, about refusing to be a bystander when something isn't fair, and about the strength it takes to push back against those who abuse their power. It's about understanding that real change doesn't always happen overnight. It's a process, a battle of persistence, and sometimes it means standing alone before others realize they can stand with you. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's that you don't have to accept injustice just because it comes wrapped in legal documents and official titles. Whether it's an HOA, a workplace, or any system that thrives on unchecked authority, you have more power than you think. The moment you start asking questions, the moment you challenge the status quo, you become a force that even the most powerful can't ignore. Mark's story isn't just his own. It belongs to everyone who has ever been told to sit down, stay quiet, and follow rules designed to keep them powerless. And if his journey proves anything, it's that one person can make a difference. One voice, one fight, one refusal to back down. That's all it takes to turn the tide. So the next time someone tells you that you can't change the system, that the rules are set in stone, or that it's not worth the fight, remember Mark. And remember that sometimes the only thing standing between injustice and change is one person willing to take a stand. Stories like Mark's remind us that standing up against injustice is never easy, but it's always worth it. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more real-life battles where people fight back and win, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps bring these stories to light. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced an unfair HOA, a power-hungry board, or a situation where you had to push back against an authority? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one.